to discuss new ways to analyze processes of transnationalization and globalization. In particular, we would like to talk about a newly developing field in the humanities and social sciences, which is called global studies. Actually, in the US, this is one of the fastest growing academic markets, with MA programs mushrooming all over the place. And one way or the other, all the people on the panel are involved in this new development. Behind this trend towards the introduction of global studies programs are major tectonic shifts in epistemological reasoning and subsequently in the institutionalization of the humanities and social sciences. Therefore, we found it useful, firstly, to introduce some of the concepts behind the development of global studies as an academic field, and secondly, to discuss these developments from different perspectives. Our first speaker, Matthias Midel, will give an introduction to what exactly global studies is all about. He will use the example of historiography to demonstrate what kind of epistemological irritations were behind the establishment of global studies. And he will also introduce the idea of post-disciplinarity. Matthias is a professor of cultural studies and history at the University of Leipzig, Germany, where he is coordinating a European master's program, Global Studies, which also involves the LSE in London, Vienna, Wroclaw, but also partners in Australia, Canada, the US, and South Africa. The second paper is given by David Simo to my left, who will provide a critical perspective on global studies and the legacy of Eurocentrism. He will look at the merits of global studies from the perspective of post-colonial theory. Simo is a professor of cultural studies at the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, where, among others, he is teaching post-colonial studies and African philosophy. In our third paper, Scarlett Cornelissen, to my far left, will discuss the promises and pitfalls of global studies from the perspective of the Global South, looking at Africa's international relations in particular. Scarlett is a professor of political science at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, which is one of the non-European partners in the Global Studies Consortium. Currently, she's on a sabbatical at Stirling University in Scotland. My name is Ulf Engel, and in the final paper of this panel, I will take the debate about the so-called failing states in Africa and Africa's changing role in globalization as a point of departure to introduce the notion of critical junctures of globalization, thus linking global studies beyond global history to developments in what is labeled new political geography. I'm a political scientist by training and work in the African Studies program at the University of Leipzig. Matthias, cheers.
Shall I touch the running system, or will do you? Okay. Huh. How to do that? Sorry? Yeah. How to do that? No.
Like this.
Oh, this one? I haven't seen it.
Okay, let's see.
Oh, okay. Now it is working. Yeah, okay.
That one.
Yeah. Okay, it works. I hope so. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce, as Ulf said, in a few words, what we understand or what is discussed right now by global studies. While in the second part, I would like to discuss a little bit the contribution by historians to that field. In the third part, I would try to differentiate a little bit how world and global history developed in the various parts of the world, not to give this idea of a centrist development of global studies, which came very much under critique over the past period. Global studies can be defined as a very fast-growing and emerging field. Interesting enough, it was not first created by a review or journal or by institutes, but by study programs being called interdisciplinary, both at the undergraduates and graduates level in the early 1990s as a reaction to the popularity of the notion of globalization. Numbers increased from some 10 to 800, 900 in each of the involved universities. It was in the very beginning a development starting in the US, but now it is not any longer a development limited to the US. But what we see is cooperation at a global level, last year in Tokyo was the first meeting of a so-called Global Studies Consortium that is really global, with 23 member universities having at the graduates level programs in global studies. And this year we have another 15 applications for membership within this organization coming from all continents. At the same time, we see global studies not only emerging at the level of individual universities, but also as transnational consortia, as Ulf mentioned it already. And we enlarged our consortium, coordinated by Leipzig University this year, by two Danish universities, Aarhus and Roskilde, but also by other Asian universities, Nehru University in Delhi, and Fudan University in Shanghai, as well as another Australian university. To give a few characteristics, global studies deals, of course, with something that might be called globalization, but under a certain perspective. That means it accepts that globalization is a long-established phenomenon, has its own historicity. I will come back to that later on. It is characterized by a dialectic process of de- and reterritorialization and leads to new spatial orders as the fundamental structure that may characterize new periods in globalization. It can be observed in all geographic arenas. It is not restricted to the global north or to the west, so therefore we need all the impact from the various world regions, and it includes not only economic and political dimensions, but also social and cultural dimensions. This means global studies has its origin in the various disciplines participating in that adventure, but under the condition that these disciplines transform themselves. So not history in the classical traditional sense contributes to global studies, but a history that transforms itself into global history. The same holds true for geography, now developing within the limits of that discipline what's called new political geography. The same for sociology, for cultural studies, and what is most important is the contribution by area studies, no longer focused on philology and literature, but also including societal developments. It can be seen that this combination of various disciplines as part of the spatial turn in all the humanities and social sciences. This conflicts with classical approaches within these disciplines. And we have to remember that disciplines as we know them and as we are structured, or as our practice is structured by them in universities, have been established in the late 19th, early 20th century, and where this disciplinization of science was in itself a reaction to the then existing globalization, when the nation state was very much at the center of reactions to global processes. At the same time, this disciplinization of science excluded previous global perspectives in science coming from the 18th century in a long and controversial discussion. The methodological nationalism that was at the basis of all the disciplines emerging in the early 20th century ignores largely transnational aspects, and that is what makes them they conflicting with current interest in globalization. My second question is what global history may contribute to that. First of all, as all historians, we are concerned with diachronic comparisons, and that may help to understand the non-linear historicity of globalization, as well as a difference between what Christopher Bailey calls a modern globalization, where all parts of the world have to contribute and are concerned by this globalization, and to distinguish it from what he calls archaic globalization, where parts of the societies were connected, and we know that in early modern times, for example, there were a lot of connections, but they were not essential to the development of these societies. This has two directions in this controversy. The one is including early modern, medieval, whatsoever you may call it, connections and connectedness to distinguish it from modern globalization, but also to polemicize a little bit this what is called the discourse of newness so dominant mainly in the social sciences, saying that globalization is a very recent phenomenon and can't be compared to historical development. The periodization when this modern globalization started is very heavily disputed among historians, but nevertheless, I guess this debate when modern globalization started and the implied criteria for that decision helps a lot to clarify our understanding of globalization. And of course, when we discuss globalization before it was called globalization, it may help us to understand that calling something as globalization is part of a project and not something that is objectively given. At the same time, I guess historians may help to overcome the too simplistic opposition between globalization and the idea of the nation state. What historians investigated over the past 20 years is exactly how the nation state fitted into the development of globalization instead of being only the protectionist other to global connectedness. So globalization can't be seen as a natural stage of human development, but only as a bundle of projects describing and pushing forward a new kind of regime of territorialization. This implies strong criticism towards traditional universal history, so there is a sharp break within historiography against the old traditions of universal history in a sort of empirical turn, as I say it here, by looking through the lenses or over the shoulders of the historical actors instead of knowing what unifies the world from a philosophical point of view. This implies an ongoing self-reflexivity also for global studies, seeing that globalization is not only an academic topic, but it transforms knowledge production itself. So global studies is not only reflecting globalization, but it is contributing to a new understanding of the world, transforming that world, the world probably itself. So the term post-disciplinarity means here that we have to transform the frameworks within which we produce our knowledge as part of the transformation that may be called globalization. And global history here focuses on processes that synchronize worldviews and experiences with that world in a world that becomes more and more polycentric at the same time. So polycentrism and synchronicity are the two categories under which we analyze from a historical point of view globalization. That means to develop new coalitions and to reposition history within the academic field. There's a new coalition with the area studies. In the early 20th century, history excluded Chinese, Indian, African, Latin American history from its topic and has now to re-include it, a process that is much more advanced in the US than in Europe, but it starts all around the world, I guess, by knowing that we can't develop historical narrative by neglecting the experience of the rest of the world. The same holds true for our relationship with social sciences. I guess there's a new division of labor. Since in the early 20th century it was established that social science are concerned with the present world while historians deal with the past. Since we are focused both now on the current globalization, we have to readjust at least this relationship. It is inside historiography as well a new coalition with those dealing with local and regional, because they are not any longer parts of a sort of nationalization, seeing the local and the regional only as subcategories of the national. I will not go into all the details here for questions of time. How much I have? Okay. To give again a definition of what global studies is focused on, it is on the one hand, and most of the emphasis in research in global studies is given to that, on flows of people, capital, goods, as well as ideas. But I would add here immediately that global studies can't only emphasize the increasing importance of flows, but has to recognize that qualitatively there are new attempts to control these flows as well. So globalization can't be seen only as an increasing importance of flows, but as a dialectic of flows and control. And this control is exercised by and at various forms of territorialization. And I mentioned here a few on this slide. And this means when we focus on territorialization as the major form of controlling flows, exercised in different ways historically, we have to analyze the processes of deterritorialization and of reterritorialization. And globalization investigation of globalizing processes are very much insisting on the deterritorializing aspect of that process, while I guess we have to focus a little bit more on the reterritorialization aspect as well. These are the causes for that ongoing process of a permanent de- and reterritorialization. We can observe that at all levels of economy, politics, as well as culture. In all these different dimensions, we can observe processes crossing boundaries, overcoming boundaries, but at the same time re-establishing boundaries, either in economic activities as well as in identity politics, or, of course, in the formation and destruction of political entities. This leads us to the notion of regimes of territorialization resulting from this process of de- and re-territorialization. So it's a temporarily stabilization in that process that can be called regimes of territorialization, and the dominance of the nation state is only one of them. So historically we can see a sequence of different regimes of territorialization, putting one form of territorialization at the center, seen as the temporally best fitting compromise between the connecting and the separating tendency in societal political development. But it is only a temporary compromise, and it comes under stress in the next period of historical development. And that brings us to the next category, critical junctures of globalization, being the moments and the arenas where the renegotiation of these trends then can be observed. And in historical terms, we see that at least in the middle of the 19th century, for the first time when the nation state emerged in various parts of the world, either as a historical reality or as an ideal to catch up with developments in other parts of the world, or as something that was imposed to these regions by external forces. We see that with colonialism and imperialism in the late 19th century. We have the Wilsonian moment in 1918 when the US for the first time proposed a new regime of territoriality to the world, as well as with the Cold War divide, and 1989 can be analyzed the same way. What's interesting is that these moments are moments of synchronization where different approaches and different ideas about how globalization should be renegotiated fit together. And the question is why they fit together at a very specific moment. And this is something we call synchronization, both of effects of structural tensions coming from financial markets, as well as the production of goods by the circulation of ideas and discursive transformation. Simo will talk about in a minute. So it's a very interesting point, not only to see the synchronization, that is what we are interested very often, but also the desynchronization after this historical moment when the New World Order emerged. What I said until that moment looks like a very homogeneous moment, a movement towards a new global history. But of course, this is a process that happens in different parts of the world in very different ways. And it's only to give a few keywords to say that we have, of course, different developments in the US where general education focuses now in a lot of colleges. A little bit less than a half of all the colleges have now global or world history instead of the elder Western civilization courses at their basis. So that means here in the educational system, we have world and global history very much at the center of general education, fitting together with globalization as a sort of American project. While we observe in China different ways and sometimes also very Sino-centric approaches towards general history or world history. While in Japan there is a concentration both in research and teaching on early modern as well as 19th century economic questions, and so on and so on. I will not go into all the details. It is only to give you an idea that all these different world regions have their very different approaches by investigating or by transforming history into global history in their teaching programs and research agendas. And to end with, I would come to Europe because others will deal with other parts of the world then. Here we have a very differentiated landscape where elder traditions of world history writing or universal history play a role. So there is only a very fragile trend towards convergence. There is, of course, a different experience with colonialism and imperialism that plays a role when it comes to the transformation into global history. We can see that when comparing French, German, and Czech discussions about the relationship between area studies and history, as well as totally different institutional settings. So there are some European countries having no area studies as an established academic tradition. And of course, for them, it is very difficult to enter this field of global history as well as global studies without this precondition. Eurocentrism remains nevertheless very, very strong in Europe, and sometimes it is even strengthened by the excessive funding of projects dealing with the identity of Europe and with the role of Europe in the world, etc. So even under the wonderful label of Europe in the world, the new 7th framework of research in Europe, you can see a lot of Eurocentric projects running. But at the same time, I guess this Europeanization of the infrastructure of research helps global history and global studies a lot to come along. And I will end with a little bit of advertising. There is a European network in universal and global history that emerged in 2002 and hold its two first European conferences. And what we see is the very slow establishment of global history as a new subfield in European historiography. When you compare it to national congresses of historians where some 2,000 to 3,000 people show up, you can see that it may be a weak movement, but it's an emerging field, as you might see from the number of presentations at these two conferences. And this European network became the forerunner and the point where also organizations in other parts of the world showed up to co-found in 2008 a network of organizations all around the world dealing with global history. And if you would like to inform yourself, you can see some journals from Germany, from Switzerland, and from Britain. And if you look for more information, there's an electronic journal that gives an overview of all the various activities, reviewing new publications in global history, reporting on recent workshops, etc. A debate on methods and theories, which is much more detailed than my overview I can give here, and develops in a sort of archive you can use all the time when you would like to know more about global history within global studies. Thank you. Oops.
Thanks, Matthias, for introducing global history to the World Social Science Forum. I now may ask Simo to, as a specialist for the history of ideas, to give us a different perspective on global studies.
Thank you very much. Well, there are different attempts to identify epistemological and methodological approaches disciplinary configurations of knowledge and theoretical frames or intellectual tradition which can help to found and structure global studies. As Matthias has showed you, this field is the combination of already existing disciplines such as history, social sciences, cultural studies, and a wide range of area studies. But as he has shown too, he has to acknowledge that this discipline have to be critically conceptualized in order to overcome epistemological limitation such as nationalism, Eurocentrism, and other myopias, to open and reopen all these disciplines to a global perspective. As he has shown too, this reconfiguration might end up decentralizing all this discipline and bringing a new horizon of post-discipline. Other people has tried to identify not so much disciplinary component of global studies, but rather the methodological approaches and intellectual traditions which have already worked out a global perspective and can be considered as the precursors of a more holistic approach to the world problems. The transnational analysis of Marxist theories, world system theories, post-colonial studies, feminism, environmentalism, and other areas that have contributed significantly to the understanding of the linkage between the local and the global, as well as to the reconfiguration of the local-global dialectics. There are different traditions of thoughts and of epistemologies, but we will just focus on post-colonial theory today. And we start by asking ourselves what it is about. And we have to acknowledge that post-colonial theory is growing, but also very contentious. It's also a very contentious field. There are many misunderstandings and misinterpretation of what post-colonial discourse is about and of what it is for. As Leela Gandhi puts it, postmodern and post-structuralist commentators argue that post-colonialism is in danger of becoming yet another totalizing method and theory, while on the other side, Marxists and other critics make the charge that post-colonial analysis lack the methodological structure and will to totalize and therefore can't provide a coherent ideology for political action. Indeed, post-colonial theory is very fragmented. Some people will even say incoherent, since it includes approaches which contradict each other. Post-colonial theory provides, nevertheless, the frame for the continuation of anti-colonial and emancipative narratives, although it at the same time deconstructs some of these narratives. The basic preoccupation of post-colonial discourse, which link the different, even divergent narratives claiming to belong to it, can be best summarized by the question which Spivak asked 1985 as a provocation to some blindness of the authorized mainstream Western academy. Can the subaltern speak? In this question, she used the Gramsci concept of subaltern class to refer to the oppressed subject, to the socially, economically marginalized people in a given society, but also on the world scale, she referred to the research which was being conducted by a group of intellectuals known as the Subaltern Studies Group. This group's objectives was to promote a systematic and informed discussion of subaltern themes in the field of South Asian studies. They were interested in studying the general attitude of subordination in South Asian society. Whether this is expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender, and office, or in another way. With this focus on subordination in a precise society, the group had the opportunity to work out general categories to depict the condition of subordination, the culture informing it. That means the whole attitudes, ideologies, and belief system which make it possible, but also the visible history, politics, economics, and sociology of subalternity. The post-colonial theory is interested in addressing the whole complex of subalternity, not only at a local scale of given society, but at a global scale in the process of globalization. The objective being not only to understand mechanism and history of exclusion, asymmetry, marginalization, but also to work out conditions for the subaltern to speak and not always to be represented by other people. In the university and in the academic world of research, the aim is to create new fields of knowledge which can help to foreground the exclusion and elisions, which confirm the privilege and authority of canonical knowledge systems, and secondly, to recover those marginalized knowledge which have been occluded and silenced by the entrenched humanist curriculum. The reference to colonization in the world in the world post-colonial means that the post-colonial theory is mainly interested in the discussion of the economy, history, and politics of the subalternity, which can be considered as the material or symbolic effect of colonialism in particular and imperialism in general. But the post-colonial theory is inscribed in the general intellectual endeavor to understand and respond to the phenomenon of subordination and marginalization in the globalizing world. Post-colonial theory is not just about subordination. It is also an attempt to organize a discourse on subordinality from a subaltern position. It assumes that the position of the subaltern implies a view from below on the functioning of the world, a view in which the subaltern doesn't appear, as he usually do, as a passive object of a subject of history, as a passive object of a subject of history who can act on him and transform him as he wants. The postcolonial theory is very skeptical and even suspicious of different attempts from the West to proclaim their own role in criticizing the end or in decreting the end of Eurocentrism, claiming that their own critique of modernity has damaged the superiority of the European model and epistemology by weakening their fantasy of domination through the relativization of absolute and the delegitimation of universals, and inviting the marginalized to be part of a new modulation of knowledge they still organize. And that's without obliging the cultural institution of the center to loosen its discursive monopoly over the right to speak. The post-colonial theory stresses the fact that the colonial world has had a center, and so does the actual globalized world. This centers radiates zones of dependent and marginalized peripheries. There is therefore an asymmetry in the production and diffusion of knowledge and meaning, as well as in the production of commodities, in the accumulation of financial means and wealth. In this sense, post-colonial theory will agree with the analysis of globalization by Wallerstein, who conceives the globalized world economy as having a distinctive, unequal structure with a core or cores, semi-peripheral and peripheral areas which maintain enormous inequality in power and wealth. But the peripheries and the marginalized people are in this process not just passive objects on which external or corrupting forces impinge, and that are transformed and restructured according to their will and needs. Subalternity doesn't mean the total loss of autonomy and initiative. It just means to act under imposed constraints. In spite of these constraints, the subaltern still acts and speaks, still elaborate strategies and narrative. The imperial process and the globalizing process is not to be seen as a process in which the West acts on the rest of the world, but as a process of confrontation, of different narratives, of different stories, of different geographies, of different strategies, and of different dynamics of localities. The postcolonial theory is very attentive to these narratives from the periphery and considered itself as such a narrative. The aim is to show that the subaltern speaks, how he speaks, and what he says. Of course, what he says is a counter-discourse and therefore dependent of the master discourse, which still map its horizon. But it is a discourse of resistance and emancipation. Those who yearn for total autonomy, purity, and identity might consider that these narratives, which are produced under constraints as response to an external pressure, they might consider that this narrative lack originality and authenticity and remain therefore just an expression of a fundamentally problematic situation which has to be overcome so as to make it possible to return to an original organic dynamism. The postcolonial theory considers the necessity to overcome the imperial and global structure of asymmetry and inequality as its own objective. 2. But it do doubt that there might have and can exist any situation of total autonomy and pure internal and organic dynamic. It rather supports a Padura'i contention that native people confined to and by the places to which they belong, groups insulated by contact with the larger world, have probably never existed. The history of all groups or society is an history of exchange and permanent renegotiation of collective identity under different degrees of pressure from outside, from inside too, and from the physical environment. There is therefore always an organic internal dynamic which reacts to external pressure and to contact with alien realities and forces. The postcolonial theory criticized, therefore, not only the narratives of an autonomous West, which is represented as having emerged as a unique and particular civilization just out of its internal logic and development and owes nothing to other civilization, but it's also critical. It's also critical to such narrative in other places, even in the periphery. Postcolonial theory is therefore rather a cross-cultural narrative stressing that not only the actual globalized reality is a product of hybridity, but also the past reality and the reality of all societies. What is interesting to examine is the creativity, the ingenuity, and the energy with which people please display to meet the different constraints, but also their shortcomings, their failures, their incapacities, and their tragedies. History is not just the history of successes. The postcolonial theory addresses not only the condition of subordination, but also the narratives which structure or are the results of the consciousness of the centrality of the West in the world. It is therefore interested in understanding how the West constitutes itself as a historical entity. The rise of the West is seen as a global history in which different factors interact, one of them being, one of the major factors being the rest of the world. That means what was mapped and conceptualized as non-Europeans and provided a contrasting entity from which the own identity of Europe was constructed. In this sense, Edward Said, in his book Orientalism, tried to show that European cultures gained in strength and identity by setting itself against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. The African-American writer and Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison has also shown the role black people played in the construction of the idea of America as white country. From the post-colonial perspective, the globality of the history of Europe is to be seen at three other levels: the influence of other civilization on Europe, the transformation of Europe in the process of imperial dominations by the import of imperial practices and experimentations in the metropolis, and the migration from Europe, in other parts of the world, but also the actual migration, which is a globalization from below, a globalization which confronts Europe with new challenges and is transforming its knowledge volumes deeply. In order to summarize what the post-colonial theory is about and what it is for, and why it is very important for global studies. So let's say global studies is about the history, the politics, the effect, and the culture of subalternity as products of colonialism, old and new imperial world order. It is also about decentering Europe, replacing it in the frame of global history, and therefore provincializing it. I thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon.
Can I just ask you to, if I have about 5 minutes left, just to let me know so that I don't run out of time. As the person who takes a less than celebratory position on global studies, I probably represent the skeptics' view on this panel. There will be lots of overlaps between what I say and what David and Matthias have said, as well as what Ulf will say. But I will try to present a critique of global studies, especially as far as its opportunities and its promises for the study of African international relations are concerned. This is not to polemicize global studies or to polemicize global studies more correctly in its early stages of development. It's just that I believe that a field of study which is self-consciously critical is a healthy field of study, and the sooner that begins within the development of a field, the better that is. My paper is motivated by 2 observations. The first is that underpinning global studies is a premise and a promise of universality. This is a quote taken from one of the new journals, the manifold journals that has arisen over the past number of years, focusing on global studies, trying to develop the field of global studies. And the self-declared aim of the journal, excuse me, inter alia, says that it tries to understand the various processes that are transforming the planet. And reading from the second sentence, the step into space and the resultant view of the planet, the new computer and media technologies of mass communication, the global spread of multinational corporations and human rights, the unprecedented environmental changes and challenges, the promise and threat of nuclear power and explosions, all have led to the increasing self-experiencing of the globe as a spaceship Earth. But this vision of universality, which enshrouds global studies, is to some extent belied by the limited geographical and institutional diffusion which the field has seen, manifested, for example, in the number of universities across the world that have dedicated teaching programs in global studies, which is separate from global studies being a field of research. If one accepts that teaching programs is an indicator of, especially at undergraduate but also at postgraduate level, is an indicator of the extent to which a particular discipline, especially a new discipline, is established and is accepted, then the degree to which global studies tends to be concentrated as a field in especially North America and certain Western European universities seems to suggest that there hasn't been an expansive take-up of the field of global studies yet. For example, there are no dedicated global studies programs in sub-Saharan Africa. And this, to me, indicates certain concerns about the epistemological dimensions of global studies, but there also are political reasons that underlie this lack of diffusion of global studies, which I will get to in a moment. The second observation, and the reason why I'm talking about global studies and its promises and pitfalls for the study of Africa and African international relations. I am a scholar of international relations, and I'm struck by the degree to which within the field of international relations, Africa has a very tenuous kind of position, a very uncomfortable position. It's regarded as the aberrant continent, the continent that hasn't followed political and economic development, which is regarded as normal in the rest of the world. As a consequence of that, it is generally ignored in mainstream analysis of international relations. But still, challenging that is some tension about the way in which Africa as a continent is viewed in the study of international relations. A tension concerning whether to view it as marginalized or whether to view it as historically integrated. And if you were to view it as integrated historically, to use that then as a position to develop historicized understandings of international politics and international relations. And how to resolve that tension. Does, for example, global studies provide some kind of insights into the shortcomings of the field which global studies partly stems out of, which is international relations? I will briefly make some remarks about global studies to provide a characterization of global studies. Out of that characterization, I will argue that global studies is not as global as the name would suggest. And I would end off by looking at a few of the ways, a number of the ways in which certain understandings, certain epistemologies could be adopted in relation, for example, to the study of the African continent. How global is global studies? I would contend that as a field, global studies faces a generic problem of demarcation. There are certain elements of commonality in the way in which global studies is defined. These include things such as there should be a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary focus, the attempt to bridge divides, be they geographical, political, disciplinary, or other kinds of divides. Global studies seeks to respond to the increasing interdependence which we are accepting is shaping the world. And globalization is often taken, therefore, as the analytical point of departure for global studies. It is a world-centric perspective which draws from a variety of disciplines, as Matthias has outlined. And there's also, as I indicated, normative promise contained within global studies, that there is the scope really for understanding the globe in all of its totality and all of the people that occupy the globe. And therefore, there's some political promise as well about having inclusive disciplinary agendas. It has become very popular over the past number of years. However, if you look at the institutions which consciously teach global studies across the world, most of them are concentrated in North America. And outside of North America, there are a few West European institutions, and some of my colleagues at German universities are largely responsible for the diffusion of global studies in the West European context. If you look outside of those particular nodes or locales of concentration of global studies, it would seem as if international studies is the preferred discipline, however ill-applied that term is as well, but the preferred discipline of choice and the preferred designation for what we regard as the international, the globus, and the politics within that globus. And if anything, international studies seems to be a field which has undergone some kind of energizing, some kind of revivalism. There's a broadening of the scope of international studies. Many departments which used to be political science departments or international relations departments are relabeling themselves as international studies departments, trying to signify the attempt to open up the research agenda. There is consequently an increased epistemological and methodological plurality that is observable within the field of international studies. And there is, at least superficially, or on the surface, there seems to be some attempt to, within the field of international studies, develop a response to the same kinds of, to study the same kinds of things which global studies want to respond to. In other words, that there is some degree of competition between international studies as a field and global studies. There is a political dimension to this because in many parts of the world not occupied by geographically the USA or Western Europe, international studies and the energizing that it has seemed is often framed in opposition to a perceived neo-imperialism in the global north in the context of the post-9/11 international security frame, meaning that a lot of international relations that is practiced by scholars in the South, a lot of international studies which is practiced, is trying to address what is seen as some kind of hegemonizing, some kind of, in that sense, imperialism, academic imperialism, which is seen, for example, in the revivalism of realism as a theoretical perspective in international relations and so forth. This kind of trend, the last one I'm describing, has been shown in surveys that have been conducted in the state of international relations. I've given the reference to one survey which has been conducted by an American institution, trying to understand the way in which scholars view international relations as a field. There are also other kinds of some of the more anecdotal indications of these shifts or changes within international relations. In the UK, some of you may be aware of the debate about the debate within and the debate about the English school in international relations and so forth. So to reiterate, there appears to be a revivalism of international relations or international studies in the global South within a specific wider international, wider ideological context, and which specifically relates to changes within international relations as a field being perceived as a hegemonic project stemming from the West and stemming from northern institutions, and certain scholars trying to react against what is regarded as the securitization of international relations and world politics more generally. There also is a different element to it, a response or an attempt by scholars in the South to try to change their feeling or sense of being off the map of knowledge production, challenging the hegemony of IR as it has footed itself as a discipline in the form of publications, main scholarly journals, and who is published or represented in those scholarly journals. Global studies, in that sense, should be regarded, or can be regarded, as a field which, in one way, tries to respond to a lot of the epistemological deficiencies which international relations manifest. But does global studies not, in another way, replicate some of those epistemological deficiencies and also some of the political and power inequities that exist within the wider field or the other field of international relations? To make global studies more global and more inclusive, what could or should it be able to offer? And what ought to be the things that interest scholars in terms of ontology and in terms of epistemology? This would mean that global studies need to do more than what international relations or international studies do. There would need to be, the field would need to be more than just extending itself geographically across the world, taking up area studies and extending established fields of area studies and expanding area studies, or adopting add-on approaches. It would mean trying to understand, first of all, acknowledging that globalization has variegated dimensions with differential impacts across the world, which is not a very new idea, but trying to understand the reasons for that and trying to really, in a robust way, discern the various ways in which those impacts of globalization manifest themselves. Appreciating that there are differential contexts for knowledge, scientific production. Assuming ontologies of ethics consciously, questioning that which is assumed to be normal and that which seemingly is universal. For example, the idea of the market and the omnipresence and ubiquity of globalization. The idea of the market, the idea that is prevalent, is one which comes from a particular kind of ideological context. True, that market as it exists in reality is one which influences almost all people's lives in the world, but the idea that that market universally is acting and is operative in the same way is not a true one. Giving privilege to agency in analyses as much as structure is the focus of analyses. And also historicizing, not being afraid of history. And the global historian in the panel will probably be very happy about that point. What does this mean from a specific perspective, from the viewpoint of Africa, and how looking differently at Africa could be a way in which one could argue that global studies can make a difference in how Africa is understood. Africa, as I said, is rightfully or wrongfully regarded as the aberrant continent, the continent where things don't really work out the way they work out in the rest of the world, where somehow the way in which political development, in which the development of the state, notions of sovereignty and so forth are manifest, that somehow that doesn't fit the normal frame of the rest of the world. And globalization is another process in that line. What about looking at these processes without the overarching guise or understanding of and how these processes play out in Africa, without the overarching guise of or understanding of that these are aberrant, that the way that they operate in Africa is aberrant? Are there ways in which globalization exists, manifests in Africa, which could be studied and understood, which provides perhaps some insight into globalization processes as a generic process across the world? Africa also provides occasion for comparative studies of, as I said before, the variegated impacts of globalizations and new regionalisms. There is a rich epistemological tradition to which African scholars have contributed already. Contributions to post-colonial frameworks have enriched many disciplines, anthropology, geography, and so forth. Contributions by African scholars to fields of feminism, critical development theory, and so forth, building on those epistemological traditions and actively and consciously trying to break down the disciplinary barriers existing between anthropology, geography, and so forth. Fourthly, there are emergent political economic alliances from the global south in which either key African states are participating in or to which they are affected by. the Brazil, India, China, South Africa, so-called BRICS alliance, the G20 plus, and so forth. These are processes, and specifically one could refer to the involvement of China and to a lesser extent of India in the African continent, which seem to defy established and accepted understandings of the international political economy. So far, we haven't yet developed the tools in international relations to understand the implications of these and the dynamics of these. And finally, analysis of African processes can yield alternative historiographies, alternative histories, which could further our understanding of common world trajectories and destinies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scarlett. I was going to say 5 minutes left, but then she was already done. In the interest of keeping some time for discussion, I will cut short my paper, which is on state sovereignty and territoriality in Africa. In this paper, initially I wanted to look at the changing nature of the state in Africa and violent conflicts in 4 steps. Firstly, briefly recalling the empirical problems which have prompted a new debate on the nature of the African state after the end of the Cold War. In principle, the argument could be extended to the economic sphere here, but again, for sake of timekeeping, I will limit my remarks to politics. Secondly, I will summarize how the conventional wisdom in political science, as well as politics, has been analyzing this problem in the past. That is mainly in terms of the so-called failing states, or when we come to politics, in terms of the global war on terror. And in the third step, I will then introduce some concepts Matthias has already mentioned from global history and new political geography, which in combination allows me, in the fourth step, to develop a different perspective on the problem of African statehood under globalization. 1989 was a watershed in the development of Africa too. The end of the Cold War triggered 2 major political trajectories, one leading to a reconfiguration of neo-patrimonial regimes in new multi-party settings, and the other leading to the implosion of weakly institutionalized regimes with little empirical statehood. So on the one hand, there was regime change in a substantial number of countries in Africa, while before '89, only 5 regimes could be labeled formal multi-party states. 10 years later, it was 35, that is 2/3 of all African states. On the other hand, many African countries experienced violent conflict, and this was closely related to the development of war economies and transnational conflict complexes in parts of the continent. So in the early 1990s, this mainly affected Angola, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Rwanda, and of course the Democratic Republic of Congo, to name just a few. And in the new millennium, these conflicts mainly played out in the eastern DRC, in the border regions of Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, and still Somalia. Now, the reasons for these conflicts have been widely discussed in African studies, initially focusing on a greed versus grievance debate, influenced either by rational choice or social constructivism. Recently, this preoccupation with violent conflict has been replaced by a new focus on borders, borderlands, and the translocal or transnational dynamics around these borders, partly implying that the state as a unit of analysis has lost some of its appeal. The developments are most visibly displayed at the Horn of Africa, where the state of Somalia has broken up into several new national or subnational entities. Some of these, like Somaliland and Puntland, are successfully claiming to exercise de facto sovereignty over territory and people, though they are not recognized internationally. New forms of local and sometimes transnational authority below the level of statehood have also emerged in the borderlands of other African countries. These entities, often not even proto-states, in many ways have proven to be more relevant to the local people than the post-colonial state. Now, in this paper, then I will argue that there's a variety of external and internal actors involved. Some of them we are familiar with: donor governments, multinational companies, United Nations system, private military companies, but also on the African side, informal traders, stock-listed African capital, growing cities, but also warlords and their commercial middlemen, new religious movements, child soldiers, area boys, and so on. So as a result of these processes, the continent has been reordered. Transnational regimes have emerged to deal with a variety of issues, such as HIV/AIDS or refugees. Subnational entities have gained strength, and new localities increasingly have come to the fore. Legal and illegal networks of trade have been integrated into globalization. As a consequence of these new entanglements, the central state has come under stress or lost importance. I will not detail the conventional wisdom that much. Obviously, there are different responses to these empirical observations. And for the most part, in African studies, people have discussed these developments in terms of declining, failing statehood, or so-called new wars that have emerged in new forms of governance beyond the state, which are in the making and which call for new political security strategies, that is containment, state reconstruction, and so on. In recent research, most of the empirical observations which inform this kind of analysis have been attributed to the specific nature of the state in Africa, which is said to be fundamentally different from its northern part, and the effects of the end of the Cold War, whose supposedly integrating effect on regimes and territories no longer work. So in fact, over the past decade, the focus of academic debate on Africa has shifted. In the 80s and early 90s, the state has been reassessed or assessed through qualifying adjectives, and now it is more imagined in different degrees of stateness. So debates on quasi-states or weak states increasingly have been replaced by debates on processes of state collapse, state failure, state inversion, or state dysfunctionality, and so on. These approaches have also found their way into mainstream political science IR. That is, the changing nature of the African state and its place in the global order is now mainly conceptualized in terms of the emergence of new medievalism, i.e. a system of overlapping authority and multiple loyalty, or simply in terms of a postmodern international order. International politics, of course, has responded in similar ways at various levels, most importantly with regard to policies of humanitarian intervention, conflict prevention, and after September 11, securitization through the global war on terror. And I'm not going to detail that, but the common denominator of both approaches in political science and among practitioners is reference to the notion of the nation state as it seemingly has developed in Central Europe since the 17th century, the so-called Westphalian system of sovereign nation states, and the idea that there is political need to restore order along these lines. In the third part of this paper, I'm arguing with reference to some ideas coming from global history on the nation state and from new political geography on the relation of sovereignty and authority. I'm not going to detail that. I'm arguing in this paper based on Charles Mayer's regime of territorialities, that these dominant forms to organize territory is something that we have to pay closer attention to, based on an understanding of globalization as it was introduced by Matthias, which is based on Neil Brenner's notion of the dialectic between deterritorialization and reterritorialization. I argue that it makes sense to look at critical junctures of globalization where spatial references and regimes of territorialization are renegotiated, are contested, often in violent forms. Secondly, I'm interested in the writings of John Agnew and others who work on sovereignty and how sovereignty relates to the territorial organization of authority. Basically, here the argument is that sovereignty itself is socially constructed and needs to be deconstructed in terms of its different properties. So the different ontological properties of sovereignty need to be put in their specific historical and geographical contexts. And against this background, the central methodological preposition of this paper is, to quote Agnew, that sovereignty is neither inherently territorial nor is it exclusively organized on a state-by-state basis. And in the light of these considerations, let's look again at state failure and the debate behind that. One could safely argue that it's not the state which has failed in Africa, but a dominant social science representation or perspective on stateness in Africa. An alternative interpretation could argue that in parts of Africa we can observe the unbundling of sovereignty and territoriality. And as a consequence of the recent forms of de- and re-territorialization in sub-Saharan Africa, new and fairly basic forms of mapping authority and territoriality are called for. There are two important academic debates feeding into this argument. One is interested in the historicity of the new social institutions of domination in Africa. The other is trying to reconstruct social anthropological bottom-up perspectives on how public authority actually works in an environment of weak stateness. This kind of research discusses a broad spectrum of empirical types of authority, ranging from stateless societies, decentralized power, local polycephaly, oligopolies of power, to pre-colonial empirical statehood. So historically, states and stateless societies coexisted in Africa, and the decentralized use of force and local pluralism in law are the standard case, not the exception. In this line of argument, the Westphalian system of sovereign nation-states, as it is frequently imagined by political scientists, obviously is still very strong in most, but precisely not in all parts of the world. In this perspective, post-Cold War Africa can be characterized as an arena where different regimes of territorialization are competing. The post-colonial regime of territoriality has been challenged in substantial parts of the continent. This is not to say that the state has been or will be replaced by something else, but clearly there are large zones in Africa where the state, as conceived in the global north, no longer is the main or the dominant form of organizing people in a given territory. And for these reasons, current developments in parts of Africa cannot be adequately understood in academic terms of state collapse, complex political emergencies, or new wars, and neither can they be conceptualized in political terms of fragile states, failing states, difficult partnerships, or terrorism. Rather, these developments represent a larger process of changing regimes of territorialization. From a perspective of the historicity of international relations, Africa has entered into a new phase whose outcome is not yet predictable. The interesting question from an IR point of view then are, how permanent will these processes be, and how do predominantly non-nation state regimes of territorialization integrate with the rest of the global order and vice versa? So to conclude, it seems that some of the familiar analytical concepts, state, nation, only make limited sense when it comes to the analysis of Africa's present state. So what's next? For me, the most important or most promising way ahead would be a very modest attempt in mapping out and describing in greater detail the dynamics which we see unfolding. So if one accepts the central methodological assumption of this paper, disentangling sovereignty and the state in parts of Africa does make sense. As a result of these efforts, the assumed hierarchy of a general spatial order around the nation-state will be challenged and ultimately deconstructed, since social life no longer can be conceived on a vector within a containerized world of nation-states from the local to the global. A variety of old and new spatial orders will be discovered, in which different social actors exercise authority and express sovereignty. Finally, Africa's place in the international system will then no longer be discussed in terms of an assumed general quality of stateness of all African states, but with a view to highlight the different regimes of territorialization which are emerging on the continent and which exist side by side and interact with the international system in very different ways. Thanks. Now it's my pleasure to open a debate. I think we have thank you, Simo. I think we have 30 minutes left, and if you could please state your name and the institution that you're representing. Please, the floor is open. And use the microphone, of course, yeah. Thank you. Yes, please.
Katja Franco-Oos, University of Oslo. I have a question for the last two speakers. And actually, what I'm hoping for is whether you can put your two papers in perspective, because you were hoping for global studies to sort of look at Africa not as an aberration, but in a way something that can give an insight into the general traits of globalization processes. So I'm thinking, is this your perspective on statehood and new types of territoriality as something that doesn't need to be centered around the nation state, but new concepts of sovereignty? Is it something that is happening also other places? And is it something is it a vision of something that is not aberrant for Africa, but it's a vision of the future?
Me, okay. I'm afraid that this observation on the deterritorialization of the nation state is something that you can also observe in post-Soviet socialist territory around the Soviet Union or now Russia. In the kind of analysis that we are producing in Leipzig with a PhD group, we will argue that there is a critical juncture of globalization after 1989, in which in parts of the world, which is not limited to Africa, the dominant order of organizing territory is highly contested, and new forms of territorialization are emerging, which in some parts are less permanent, but if you look at Somalia, which always is a good case for the past 20 years or so, seem to have some permanence. But
your question was whether this aberration exists elsewhere. Yes, I think that's the important point to make, is that even though you can describe Africa as aberrant, is that aberration does or is a feature of many parts of the South, especially as far as aspects of sovereignty is concerned, and competing aspects or formations of sovereignty. And in the post-Cold War era, the opportunity or the space has just been opened up that much more for different groupings to challenge established or accepted forms of sovereignty. And but that's the argument, is that does global studies present a set of tools to understand these processes all over the world, and is there an underlying dynamic which is common, which global studies can expose?
Simo, would you like to add?
Just one word. Indeed, it's interesting to see the whole process of reconfiguration of territorialization in Africa today. But I think it's important to see it in the global context, not just as a very specific African process going on, informed by I don't know which special African spirit, but also as a dynamic, I would say global dynamic, where different forces are interacting. The same process, we observe the same process in the 60s and in the 70s and even in the 80s. And it was informed also, not of course, by will and perspective of local actors, but also by attempts of territorialization of at a global scale. You know, you had different forces, which were international forces, which of course has explained some of the processes which were going on, and so it is today too. You can totally ignore that.
My question is to Professor Middahl. I think you made a distinction between premature opposition to globalization and nation states, referring to premature opposition or legitimate criticism of the two phenomena. What is the boundary between the two? That's my question, between the premature opposition and the legitimate criticism. Did I make my question clear? I think there was a point that one of the purposes of the global studies was to eliminate this early or premature opposition to the ideas of processes such as globalization and the nation states, which go hand in hand. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's collect two more questions. Mr. Krieger and then in the back.
Did I mention that I'm from Turkish Academy of Sciences?
Not really. Thank you.
Most event. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Robert Krieger. I'm with the National Research Foundation, but that's not exactly what I wanted to say here. In describing myself, first of all, I'm a linguist and I'm a student of literature, and I studied some theology. And when I listen to descriptors such as aberration or deterrorization, etc., I become particularly concerned, not only about where the concept emanates from, but also where it's rooted. Mm-hmm. And I think we've heard Westphalia mentioned here several times. I wonder of what relevance does the fights of kings have to do with Africa's aberration to a notion which is not of its own making. So I find it extremely difficult that if we utilize concepts of this very nature, when in fact the practice of universality of concepts and universality of ideas becomes the universality of discourse, when in fact that so-called universal discourse has never recognized its underbelly. It has never understood, let's take the German example, of the role and relevance of the Bauernkriege in Germany, of Thomas Müntzer, in actually enforcing a new state or a concept, although it only came 2 centuries later, which we should also remember. So I find it extremely difficult when we apply this to something like Africa, and we totally disregard the fact that Europe itself has never resolved those issues. And you wouldn't have a non-existent Yugoslavia if you had entered that into your discourse. So the very notion of your history, I find, is problematic. And therefore, whether you're going to call it global studies or whatever, it's not against you, but I mean against this concept. I find it rather strange. And therefore, I would also find it very difficult to understand and accept an invitation to participate in the discourse unless the subaltern within your universalist notion is also understood and clarified. Thank you.
Good point, thank you. And then we have one last question in the back, and then we go back to the panel and have another round of questions.
My name is Jana Svetluk. I'm a PhD scholar at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. I have a question to Ulf Engel. At the beginning of your speech, you have mentioned about connection of postcolonial theory to post-structuralism and postmodernism, very briefly, but and you did not elaborate on this, but I wonder if you see some kind of contradictions between post-structuralism and Foucault and his criticism of Western institutions of power and so on, and post-colonial standpoint, because I think that there are some kind of exotic images of Foucault in relation to the East and to non-Western territories, so to speak. And I have another question about You did not mention anything about, you have talked about giving a voice to subaltern, but what about subaltern criticizing its own problems, internal problems? Because I think this is also an important part of postcolonialism.
Thank you very much. Matthias, will you start?
Yeah. First of all, the argument, probably it was a little bit too short, comes exactly from that background that we need history to understand current problematics of interpreting globalization. So what we see is that globalization, following very common standards, so more foreign direct investment, faster communication, more connectedness between different parts of the world, emerged in the second half of the 19th century at the same time when the nation state came up. So often it was interpreted in historical accounts in a way that so free trade propagandists tried to overcome the nation state, and the nation state became a sort of obstacle to globalization. While recent historical investigation demonstrates that it was the nation state and its elites, both in political and economic and cultural terms, try to connect their nation states with other parts of the world, of course, to take with the aim to take profit from it, not to do a cosmopolitan, wonderful work or something like that. So, I guess what we can conclude from that is, first, in a certain historical period, the nation state became a very important agent of globalization. And when we try to theorize that further, I guess we have to ask, what are the aims of that, of those agents of globalization? And I guess here it is a sort of reformulation. Their aim is not only to connect with other parts of the world, might be economic or in other forms, but to secure at the same time a partly existing autonomy. And we can apply that to other elites or groups, even looking from below, how they integrate into that globally connected world. So it is always these dialectics of organizing social integration, partly autonomy, sovereignty, and to connect with other parts of the world. I guess this is the lesson we can learn from historical investigation about the role of the nation state in a previous period of globalization. At the same time, I would insist on the fact that the nation state was at the center of organizing territoriality in a certain period, but this period ended somewhere. I mean, most of the researchers agree that it was at the turn from the 60s to the 70s in the 20th century. And then we have a sort of reorganization of the different forms of territorialization. And territorialization means more than territoriality. It means also transnational networks, and not only the territorialized state, region, and so on. So I guess this, the nation state has a certain function, but the system we call regime of territorialization has changed since the 60s and 70s. So there are fundamental changes by including other parts. Come back to your question about these differences or difficulties with the languages. I guess what is the most important in global studies is what I would call an empirical turn, simply to look what happens. When you go to workshops on Somalia, you will find a lot of people applying whatever abstract categories instead of studying in a very concrete way what happens in Puntland, for example. So that would be my first point, that we have to go further with that empirical turn to investigate things as concrete as possible, because it reduces the pressure of categories we have taken, as you said, from other empirical findings. So from, let's say, European experience, we have developed mainly in social sciences categories. We apply them to totally different empirical evidence. So only with this empirical work, I guess, we can come to your point and to overcome this enormous imposition of strange categories to other empirical situations. And then the question is, how can we develop a language that can again generalize what we have found, because we can't stay in that trap of simply empirically investigate. And I guess that this language, this probably terribly difficult to pronounce language of territorialization, helps us to find categories that may apply to different empirical evidences in other parts of the world. And I wouldn't reduce it to Africa and Eastern Europe in the way that you can say, okay, they are aberrant as Eastern Europe. But I would say we can apply that as well to the United States or to Western Europe or to Asia, and to describe it as a permanent dialectic of de- and re-territorialization, because this language is not taken from a very specific historical experience, as you said, let's say the Peasants' War or the state formation process in the 18th and 19th century in Western Europe, where most of the language of the social sciences comes from. So I guess this is exactly in the line of your argument, what we try to do. But I agree, on the other hand, that there is inside global studies, of course, a lot of differences, and not all would agree with that approach, evidently, and we have to go further with that debate.
Simo, would you like to answer that question on post-colonialism versus post-structuralism?
Yes. It's a very long story, you know. I just want to make two observations. Post-colonialism adopted many categories of post-structuralism. At the same time, post-colonialism oriented itself in another direction than post-structuralism. That's why you will find critics from post-structuralists on post-colonialism. That's you will find. And what concerns Foucault, of course, Foucault wasn't the categories which were taken from Foucault didn't mean that the post-colonial theory wanted just to adopt Foucault as, let's say, the father of post-colonial theory. They took just some categories, and three of them. The category of discourse, it's central. The category of power, you know, knowledge and power, and those are the two categories, knowledge and power. These are the two categories which were taken from Foucault. But at the same time, the post-colonial theory is critical of any attempt, especially from the Western scholarship, to speak in the name of others. That is considered to be problematic. That's for that point. The second point you mentioned is, of course, the multiplicity of the voices of the subaltern. That's true. The post-colonial theory doesn't think that the subaltern speak just in one voice. The subaltern speak in different voices, even in contradictory voices. That's an evidence.
Maybe just one brief remark to Robert Kriegler's question. I think the point of departure for my argument is that one discipline, in particular political science, has failed to give us categories to understand recent or not so recent dynamics in Africa because of the heavy normative overload of many of these categories, like the state. And I regard the spatial turn, the bringing back in space as an analytical category, as an opportunity, as a chance to reconsider some of our observations and interpretations. But for that to be fruitful, I think one has to start very modestly at the level of making observations, trying to build categories, typologize things, before coming again with big theories. And in this regard, I regard spatial term debates as fairly universalistic as opposed to particularistic and with normative overload. But probably we have a chance to discuss that a bit over lunch. Okay, next round of questions. Oh, sorry, Scarlett.
Since I'm the one who introduced the term, the defiled term of aberrant, maybe I should just encamp my defense. I use that term as a descriptor for the deliberate marginalization of Africa in the field of international relations. And the reason or the explanation I give for that is because, in my view, Africa is regarded as not fitting the mold, not fitting the typologies. So it's not a term I'm using to describe Africa, it's a term I'm using to describe the scholarly positioning towards Africa. And also, maybe following your last point about finding the voice of the subaltern, I think I also do that from the position of subaltern, because the way in which Africa is described and the way in which the academic imagineering, which is involved in marginalizing Africa in the mainstream field of international relations, is coming from the position of privileged scholars to a large degree, the ones who are shaping knowledge about Africa. If I'm the one coming from the South and criticizing that and calling for a different way of looking at Africa, doesn't that make me the subaltern trying to raise my voice in a heavy voice of domination?
I have a problem with sound.
She will join us for lunch. So.
Thank you very much for these very interesting contributions. My name is Hakan Sıcakkan. I'm working at the Department of Comparative Politics at this university, and I'm also leading a large-scale European Union-funded project, Eurosphere. My question is about the inductive approach to science and the radical empiricism that has been very much favored in this panel by at least two panelists. I have a sense for it, I should say. But on the other hand, this is more of a comment than a question, but I would like to see your response too. My question is, how are you going to distinguish the new from the old if you don't use the old concepts when you're researching into phenomena that you're talking about? If you're going to invent the wheel one more time, why are you going to spend all the time? So my recommendation would be to focus more on disempowering the dominant concepts while researching and empowering the contextually sensitive concepts where you're doing your research. And then by using these old concepts, identify the new ones and add your new categories into what you're doing. This is what we're trying to do in our project, at least, because the European Union context that we're researching into is also suggesting some new developments that need new categories. And it's also suggesting some new processes where you need to disempower the dominant concepts of the nation, etc. This is my comment. Thanks.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, please.
So my name is Edouard Morena. I study sociology at King's College London. And I just want to come back on the concept of, well, subalterns and subaltern studies. Because, I mean, I have trouble in understanding how subalterns can be how can subalterns be studies in themselves? I mean, is not the term subaltern a totalizing concept in a way? So I have difficulty in seeing how, on the one hand, we can try and bring out multiplicity, but at the same time, through post-colonial studies and subaltern studies, we try to totalize them within and use totalizing concepts such as subalterns. And my second point is there not a risk also of not addressing the relations of subordination that exist within subalterns by breaking the distinctions, for example, by placing class, ethnicity, gender on the same level, or by considering a group as a group of subalterns? Is there not a risk also of completely of not considering the relations of domination that exist within these groups?
Okay, one last question. Last chance. If that's not the case, Matthias will start.
If it is allowed, I would like to ask back how you disempower old concepts. Can you explain that a little bit? Because it's difficult to comment on agreeing or disagreeing about the disempowerment of old concepts if I have no idea of how that works. Will you kill elder professors, or is it encouraging students to take new approaches, or is it writing more than the others? I have simply no clue how you disempower.
Okay, I can send you some papers about that, but I can give some clues at this point here too. By disempowering the dominant concepts, I mean using different conceptualization of the same phenomenon in one and the same research and treating them equally as normative, giving them equal ontological and epistemological status at the point of departure instead of prioritizing one of them. This is what I mean, and this is what we have been operating with for some years, and we're getting some good results. So,
you know, the argument by Scarlett, for example, is that there is a power relation within academia.
Yes.
And my question was sort of how we can change these power relations when it comes to disempowerment. I mean, simply writing and doing research and having the better argument may help yourself to know that you have the better argument, but it is not by itself translated into a powerful position within academia.
Well, that's correct, but what I'm saying is my focus is how to represent reality.
Okay.
If you can represent it in different ways by using different notions, and you can do this in your single research. Of course, the power relations at the university and academia are also important. You might do this and you might end up not publishing any of this at all, because many journals would like to have very clear normative points of departure and ontological approaches.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, yeah.
Thanks for clarifying again.
Thank you. Yes, totalizing concepts of alternative. You are perfectly right. These are critics which are formulated against the post-colonial theory most of the time, that it is about deconstructing totalizations and disrupting binarism, but constructing itself some sort of binarism, you know. The fact is that, and I can give you that as an answer, you need a sort of strategic totalization, you know. It is a strategic totalization because it is done while knowing that it is a totalization, and such criticize too, deconstruct too. That means if you take the text of Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? In fact, it was a critic to subaltern studies, although it formulated an important question, general important question, but it was a critic too. She wanted to say that the subaltern can speak only through the mouth of the intellectual will work out their voices, you know. Just to give you right that indeed, even in the subordination, but the subordination is a fact. That means the existence of a core and peripheries, semi-peripheries and peripheries. That is the situation. But of course, even the core is not homogeneous, you know, and the peripheries is not at all homogeneous. That is acknowledged and addressed, you know. And within the periphery, of course, you might have even contradictions. That's why I say the subaltern don't speak with the same voice all the time. But what is important is that at least the voices existed, and that is important to include them into the field of knowledge, you know, whether they are opposed, and most of the time they are opposed. If you take the gender voices, of course, it's not exactly the same voice. If you take the case of India, you have caste voices, you know, within the subaltern conditions, you know. But nevertheless, it is as a whole a subaltern condition, but which is not homogeneous at all. That's what I would say.
Matthias, there was that question on inductive approaches and radical empiricism, how to distinct the new and the old.
Can you go with that?
Please, you will do
Matthias.
Matthias.
I mean, as I said before, there is this idea that we have probably to, or the only way to criticize efficiently this enormous normative overload is not to go further within the existing framework of categories. And here Scarlett, I guess, is totally right in criticizing to what extent global studies in the early 90s, when it grew up, was accepting categories coming from the previous theoretical development as statehood, as civil society, as democracy, and so on, to describe a sort of the fast formation of a homogeneous world, the end of history, etc., etc. And therefore, I guess the reaction to that, or one reaction to that, is of course to emphasize the role of the subaltern and to insist on a totally different perspective, and to say global studies can't have only one perspective. And the other is that what I call the empirical turn, not with the aim to destroy only an existing epistemology by empirical findings, but of course to build up also a new theoretical framework. But bringing the two together is a very difficult task. That means to think at the same time global studies as a polyphonia, where I have to accept that globalization is not an existing natural thing, but a bundle of very different projects. So Africans have their own projects, how to globalize, Americans have their own, etc., etc. So to think that all the time while analyzing the effects of the meeting and the negotiation and the clashes of these different projects in the real world. And I guess we are somewhere on the road towards a new understanding of globalization that will probably replace that very naive understanding of globalization as simply being a linear way towards a homogeneous world where all the liberal markets will exist and the nation state will be overcome by global governance and all these funny things. And by definition, when you think these two processes together, people insisting on that project, because we historicize in effect what was a sort of common wisdom into a political project, these people will resist to that reinterpretation of their doing. So this inductive strategy has a political implication as well. And of course that can happen only when we can secure that global studies, or however we will call it, remains a sort of space where these different perspectives can negotiate. And therefore I asked you back how to deal with the power relations existing, of course, also inside global studies. I mean, as Scarlett said, it's an enormous economic success of American universities taking $30,000 per student in global studies in the undergraduate level. And that gives them more power than probably criticizing it from the subaltern approach or whatsoever. So simply in dollars you can count sometimes these power relations. I guess this is a contradictory situation, and I wouldn't say that global studies will save the world by replacing elder interpretations, but at least we can describe it as a conflictual field. That may help probably to bring out some of the contradictions we live in our world right now.
Scarlett, can I invite you for last comment?
Yeah, just on the point of how to distinguish the old from the new. I'm not speaking about about the demerits or the merits of global studies. I'm supposed to be the critical voice here on this panel. But just to elaborate what Matthias has said, shouldn't the ontological point be that there really is something new, that the old, or what we perceive as the old, is really just the continuation, or what we would define as new has some kind of older historical basis. So in terms of methodology, I suppose, that probably takes you to the point where you are really encouraged to discard, first of all, categories of old and new, but it means having a starting position of understanding origins of processes, the historical rootings of processes and so forth, which then also leads you to a different kind of plurality in terms of how you then try to understand the unfolding of those processes. But I think old and new as labels in this case are inadequate or inappropriate.
I can see that you're trying to buy your ticket for lunch. We will continue at lunch. We have to close this one. I'd like to thank you all for your kind participation. I learned that it's not a good idea to invite historians and linguists to social science meetings, but I think this is what global studies is all about. Thank you very much.